Today my guest is the scholar, literary theorist, and author Stephen Greenblatt. Professor Greenblatt is John Cogan University Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University. He is one of the world's foremost Shakespeare scholars and the inventor of the literary field known as the New Historisism. Stephen Greenblatt, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thank you, Paula. Nice to be here.
Well, I have read that you were a bookish boy in a family that wasn't particularly bookish. In fact, I think you wrote somewhere that they wanted you to watch more television.
Yes, I thought I was spending much too much time reading books.
And I wonder, did you think of yourself at the time as an odd or special sort of person growing up as a bookworm? And I wonder, you know, having written a recent book about medieval monks or involving medieval monks, if you think that some of the academic sorts or boys and girls that read a lot as children are sort of like the monks of olden times, and they exist sort of on the side of the mainstream of society.
It's an interesting question. I shouldn't exaggerate my bookishness, either for good or ill. I spent a lot of time throwing a ball or outside or playing. But when I was inside, it's true that I got caught up in books and I loved them. And my parents were worried not so much that I had my nose in books too much, but that it would be bad for my eyes.
I know that your mother was an important influence on you growing up. You've written about this. I mean, it sounds like she had, in a sense, an ideal of scholarship that you went on to realize, but also there was a hurtful side to her influence, which was this continual fear of death that you've written about. It's both in your recent book and it was excerpted in the New Yorker, so I guess it's commonly known, and you feel retrospectively that it was very painful for you as a child to be dealing with that. And I often wonder if your retreat into books and into history in particular might have some bearing on a way of protecting yourself from being with a mother who was so fearful of dying.
You know, I feel a little guilty even talking about it because I don't want to pretend my upbringing was Dickensian in some kind of abjection or horror. It was an ordinary middle-class upbringing in a perfectly nice house with a mother who loved me, adored me, actually. If my problems growing up were at least as much, or my retreat was at least as much from extravagant love as it was from fear.
That can be very painful too.
From fear of death. But it is the case that my mother's own life was, to some extent, shadowed, almost blighted by her terrible fear that she was going to die and die young. So I grew up in the shadow of this anxiety that she had and that she couldn't help. There were a number of different ways of dealing with it, but it probably is the case, Paula, that one of the ways I dealt with it was through retreating into my imagination. I want to say quickly, not only defensively, but I don't want to exaggerate my brooding melancholy, Hamlet-like melancholy. My father was a kind of passionate jokester and weaver of comic stories. So if I grew up with the tragic side of life, I also grew up with a irrepressible Falstaffian humor in my father. So
maybe it was the ideal childhood.
Well,
for
I don't want to.
Whatever.
I can imagine it something calmer than it was, or suddenly pulled less in dramatic directions. But look, you and I and everyone who's going to watch this has stories to tell from childhood. That's why we have access to literature. That's how we have access to life, is that each of us bears the burden of pain and pleasure, of suffering and of joy, that in different ways. It comes in different ways. So these were my ways.
And this new historicism, which I think somewhere you've referred to as cultural poetics, which is more poetical than new historicism. How would you define that and the impact that it's had on literary study?
The important thing to grasp is that it comes out of a particular context, like everything else. And the context was a new criticism that had as its central proposition that it fundamentally doesn't matter who made something or who's receiving it, who's reading it. What matters is the internal structure of a great work of art. And New Historicism was an attempt as we imagined it, to open the windows up and say, look outside, look at the world that created our world, but also the world, the historical world that created these works, the world in which people were embedded, the world in which we're embedded, and to bring those into play.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Stephen Greenblatt, for giving us your time today and your insights.
You're welcome, Paula. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel Interview.